All right, so part two of Silent Spring. Let's just wrap up Silent Spring here in a very, very simple manner. What can we say about this? It's a book that started the environmental movement. It borrows everything that it wants to in terms of its rhetoric to make its public case. It borrows a lot of literary qualities, was a sensation. Beyond that, we might say, for the needs of our course, Rachel Carson here is creating a public or creating a discourse community. People didn't have these values, even though they were sort of floating around there, but she tied the ends together to create essentially the need for an environmental movement. To keep not only the environment but human health stable in a society that she claimed is out of control in some ways. So what can we learn about her rhetoric? What are the things that you can steal for your own papers? You can either analyze for your rhetorical analysis through some of these things, or you could actually use these for your life form paper, which is a paper that comes later in the course. We see some really excellent rhetoric here. We see this sort of beatific, perfect world here, the world of the past, the golden age, we could call it, I suppose, right? That appears first. Then we start to see the strangeness, the mysteriousness, the uncertainty creeping right here, controlled very much in this paragraph. We then start to see the results of this, the strange stillness, nature is dying, some more sort of apocalyptic rhetoric creeping in here, right? Doomsday-ish stuff going on inside of what is a fable. We see the specific drawdown to reproduction right here in this paragraph, right? And maybe that even triggers something in the reader, as I mentioned in the previous video. Here we have the roadsides, the vegetation is dying too, so we moved on from animals to plants. Paragraph by paragraph, notice, is very, very specific, each with its own rhetorical intention, its own rhetorical framework. No witchcraft, she says here. So it isn't supernatural, she says. This is, she knows what she's doing, despite the fact that we're in a fable and we're doing all this uncertainty and mysticism and stuff like this. She says, no, this is not witchcraft. The people had done it to themselves, right? So it's the warning right here. So she knows what she's doing when she says no witchcraft. She's aware of her own rhetoric, right? If we want to move on quickly, and recap chapter 2, some really excellent things that are going on here. We can look for a few things. We can look again at sort of the uncertainty that we have here in the mix of mysticism right alongside strontium-90 and her explanation of underground streams and how they work and stuff like this, right? And their effect here, the scientific effect at the end. Here we have an explanation in this paragraph of how evolution worked. It took hundreds of millions of years for these things to work, these ecosystems to work together. And in just a short time, just a few decades really, this has all come undone, right? So she's explaining what she needs her reader to understand in terms of knowledge, should the reader not be thinking of it that way. And then one of my favorite paragraphs, the rapidity of change, the we're out of control, things are going too fast frameworks that you see here. Right, and so there's many more inside of here, but we will leave off there so we can move on to some other things. So all of those are key ways of communicating your message to the public. I guess we'll say steal them as you may, and that would be a fantastic thing to do. Let's take just a brief look. We won't look at the readings too much, but just a list of ideas from the 2 other readings that you had that comment on Carson's Silent Spring. So we're looking now at the introduction by Lear, which I had you read. Gives you the nice working history. And there's not really too much to interpret here. It's not literary. It's just a nice commentary on all the things, the historical background and context. But what do we get out of this? It's really, really important, again, that's worth knowing. The Cold War rhetoric and public knowledge, that she used the fear of the atomic war and fallout as an analogy for science outpacing our morals and our application of science. She questions the government here. Why is the government abandoning its citizens? Lear tells us this is a major component of Silent Spring. Why are citizens not being protected from chemicals, right? We start to see here an important argument that being protected from chemicals is a citizen right. It was never thought of that way previously. Other things that we see, human beings not in control. This is sort of that speed and out of control paragraph as much as anything inside of the reading. We're just one of nature's parts. There's a certain independence between people and the environment. She's explaining ecology, right? But what is she also doing? This is probably worth breaking here for you. She's providing this is Lear's claim, that Carson is providing a counter-narrative to the idea that humans can control their science, control nature, control technology in all of its forms, right? And so this is a pretty important idea. This narrative was not out there. Nobody was talking about this, science being out of control. This is important. Just a few other things worth mentioning briefly. The attacks and responses to Carson are captured in the article as well. There are many, but they probably break down to this. Her lack of professional credentials, that her sex or her gender, she was called just a hysterical woman. We don't see quite as much of that nowadays, but 60 years on, there's still a lack of women in the sciences. Science is seen as a man's domain very much, unfortunately. But we can see the 1950s, 1960s attitudes that appear as well in these responses to her. The last thing that didn't really come up in the reading that I would suggest is that it wasn't scientific enough. Maybe that goes with her lack of professional credentials, that the writing style wasn't scientific, and somehow the style omitted important information. Because you can't write a fable or write in the way that she does about science and still capture science, which probably is not true. But that was the attack nonetheless. The other thing that comes up in here that's real important is this is the beginning of what's known as gray literature, scientific and pseudoscientific research that corporations back in the early 60s and throughout the 60s and to today started to put out to discredit environmental and human threats. So anytime important information came out about chemicals in the environment and their potential affecting people, there was a large corporate sponsorship of research to try to prove that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that it was something else. Maybe it wasn't harmful, maybe it would take longer, larger amounts of it, something like this. But it's referred to as gray literature. And there is still a ton of it out there. You might be thinking of climate change, right? And all of the climate change literature that people use to debunk climate change and say it's not a problem. 97 out of 100 scientists agree that it is a problem and human-made, yet there's still just as much literature floating around that seems scientific, claiming that climate change is not a problem or is not human-made, right? So this is known as gray literature or just pseudoscience. Lastly, just worth pointing out, again, that she did create communities. I think in the interest of time, we're going to move on here to Apocalyptic Narrative by Killingsworth and Palmer. All right, so your other reading, your final reading on this was a detailed analysis from Killingsworth and Palmer here, what I just refer to as the apocalyptic rhetoric or apocalyptic narrative reading. So we're going to talk about this real quick. Again, I'm not going to walk you through everything. You've read this and you responded and you got what you could. Here's some things that I hope you got out of it that would be seen as important for the duration of our course and just this type of rhetoric in general. So we can just go to A here on page 21. What do we find? Apocalyptic rhetoric is used to combat ideas of progress, right? So if we can maybe move on to B first. Apocalyptic rhetoric isn't used by groups of people that believe the last days are here and the world is about to end. Rather, it's used to create, and we just saw this in Lear, a counter-narrative to the science tech industry's belief in our victory over nature, and maybe people's general belief in victory over nature, that we can control all of this. And so apocalyptic rhetoric is sort of a scare tactic, or better yet, a counter-narrative to combat ideas of progress, that science can't save us all the time. We need to be careful with science. And so that's what it was used for typically. Now, how effective is it? It depends on the historical moment, depends on the issue, all of these different things, right? The articles, we're on C, articles analysis finds it's often used more as a shock tactic at crucial moments, and it doesn't become a powerful counter-narrative. And this is going to be borne out in later research in the course as well, more psychological-based research. But even here we're seeing this apocalyptic rhetoric, basically fear, isn't all that useful for long-term change. And that's what I've jotted down here too. Short-term victories. We could even see Silent Spring as a short-term victory. It created a public or a discourse community, got people talking, but it wasn't going to solve the problem alone. So long-term success and behavior changes may require something other than apocalyptic rhetoric, maybe even something other than logic. But it did start the discussion, and that's maybe a good way to think of apocalyptic rhetoric. All right. So what else is going on here on page 23? Here's a major takeaway. Those that are not paying attention to what's going on around them, the public's not paying attention, believe in the progress narrative. And really, it's our reliance on rationalism, that we're rational creatures who can use logic, because that can lead us to think again that science will save us, that we can use ourselves, that we're in control of everything. So sometimes I guess the takeaway here is you need something a little irrational, a little fear-based to point out that we can't always control the rational. Or because the other way to do it is to logically point out that rationalism and scientism can't save us. But then you're just fighting logos with logos, right? Rationalism with rationalism. And maybe that isn't appealing to a lot of people, and maybe that isn't the best way to go about it. So it does work as a counter rhetoric, an entirely different type of framework to try to make people pay attention. So you're not fighting logos with logos. That's not going to be incredibly exciting for a lot of the public. They'll get a little lost in the information. What else is going on here? Pages 23 and 24. If belief in science can be the problem, and especially if it suggests that humans can control nature. So 23 and 24, I think I'll let you read those briefly on your own. I've kind of mentioned those things. Maybe we'll keep moving here. So here's another important point that's a little bit newer. Page 25, one thing that comes up is the critique of the progressive narrative is used by environmentalists here. Here's what people say in response, if they're progressive, if they believe in science. If we don't keep doing what we're doing, we'll slip back into the past, some antiquated, uncomfortable past where there's no running water and there's, I don't know, contagious outbreaks or whatever it is. But that's not necessarily true. We can probably keep all the good of science and still reel in some of the bad, right? But you will find narratives pushing back against, Silent Spring and its movements, saying, listen, we have to keep doing what we're doing. We need all of this science. We need all these chemicals, or otherwise there's going to be food shortages or whatever it may be. And so you will see this narrative pop up in public as well. So in addition to this idea that we have to keep doing what we're doing and we'll slip back into the past, that's one pushback against Silent Spring. And maybe I should jot that down here. I did not jot that down. So these are responses to, we'll just say, environmentalism. Another one could be that science, even if it creates problems, will provide the solutions. This seems to make sense, right? Science has solved so many problems. Whatever problems it creates can just be solved with more science. However, as many have argued, new technology, new science always brings with it unforeseen consequences. If you can predict the bad, maybe you can solve it, but you can't always predict the bad. One example would be human-induced climate change, right? And that science isn't fixing it so far. So this isn't always a great narrative, although it is a narrative that you'll see functioning in society a lot when it comes to environmentalism. Yeah, in some ways it's true. We don't want to totally write that off. Here's something that does not come up in the readings, but is true. Water, when it comes to water and sustainability right now in the 21st century, household use only accounts for about 10% of all water that is used in the world. So that's sanitation and drinking water and cooking and what have you. 70 to 80% of the world's water supply in any given year that's used up is used by industry. So who can really help us save water if there's going to be water shortages? Well, it's probably not going to be us turning off the water when we brush our teeth, even though we should. Clearly, science, industry, technology, because it uses so much, it needs to innovate. And it is where we can make great savings in sustainability and water usage, right? So yeah, science is kind of the answer at the same time, but we need to be careful with believing in that too much. And that's exactly what the apocalyptic rhetoric is all about. It's trying to provide a counter narrative, the idea that science will always save us, right? We've got a few more things here. We don't have too much time left. If we want to return to Silent Spring briefly, the rate of resource loss and purity becomes important in Silent Spring. There's, as the article points out, there's analogies to the Cold War and the nuclear era anxiety, which I pointed out in video 1. Silent Spring borrows from the fable, the tragedy, from heroes and villains rhetoric. Eventually we find out that the heroes are the people who are willing to believe in this. We definitely know who the villains are, the people who are creating these chemicals and not really letting us know, or the scientists who are not bringing this information to the public become, quote-unquote, the villains, at least for a little bit in Silent Spring, even though they're part of the solution for Carson 2 if you were to read the whole book. You see here just a few closing ideas. The apocalyptic narrative and fear can be used by many, including by Carson's imitators, but as the article points out, it doesn't always work. The framework depends upon the moment. Who are the heroes and villains? What public anxieties are going on at the time? What are the discourse communities and publics involved? And of course, it's probably just a short-term fix. Something longer term to sustain interest will be needed. All right, hope you enjoyed Silent Spring. Thank you.